The Vietnam War was one of the most harrowing conflicts in modern history. It was a nightmare for both soldiers and civilians, with jungle warfare, hidden enemies, booby traps, and psychological tactics. From ambushes to nightmarish weapons, soldiers faced challenges they never anticipated. This article delves into some of the most terrifying aspects of the war, exploring what soldiers endured and the psychological and physical horrors they faced, from brutal combat to the use of dark psychological warfare. Strap in, because the tale of the Vietnam War is not just a history lesson, it's an eye-opening look at the unimaginable terror faced by those on the front lines. A jungle of enemies. The Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965 was one of the deadliest and most intense battles of the Vietnam War. The 1st Battalion of the 7th Cavalry, under Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore, was airlifted into a remote area in South Vietnam, unaware of the massive force awaiting them. They soon encountered over 3,000 North Vietnamese soldiers in fierce hand-to-hand combat. Surrounded and vastly outnumbered, the Americans faced tremendous difficulty due to the dense jungle and the enemy's close proximity. Despite reinforcements, the battle raged on through the night. By the 3rd day, the Americans secured a landing zone, but at a heavy cost. 79 Americans were killed and over 1,200 North Vietnamese soldiers were slain. On the 4th day, an ambush at another landing zone resulted in 150 more American casualties. Ia Drang marked the brutal nature of the war and showed the Americans they were up against a determined, formidable enemy, the hidden enemy. The Viet Cong, a guerrilla force in South Vietnam, played a central role in the conflict. Experts in unconventional warfare, they used tactics like ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run attacks. They didn't wear uniforms, often blending in with the local population, making it difficult for American soldiers to distinguish combatants from civilians. One of the most unsettling aspects of fighting the Viet Cong was the constant paranoia among U.S. troops. The enemy could be anyone, a farmer, a child, or a neighbor. This was especially true during the Tet Offensive in 1968, when the Viet Cong launched surprise attacks across South Vietnam, including infiltrating the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Although the offensive ultimately failed, it shattered the illusion of American progress in the war, shifted public opinion, and exposed the fragility of U.S. strategy. The horrifying world of the tunnel rats. One of the most terrifying jobs during the Vietnam War was that of the tunnel rat. The Viet Cong had constructed an elaborate network of tunnels throughout Vietnam, including around Saigon, where they could move supplies, avoid detection, and launch surprise attacks. These tunnels were not just simple passageways, they were a labyrinth of underground chambers, booby traps, and dangers at every turn. Soldiers known as tunnel rats were tasked with crawling into these dark, cramped tunnels to search for enemy soldiers, weapons caches, and intelligence. They were often smaller in stature as the tunnels were narrow and claustrophobic, making it difficult for larger soldiers to navigate. Armed with only a flashlight, a weapon, and their wits, tunnel rats ventured into the depths, facing the constant threat of ambush or deadly traps. The tunnels were filled with dangers beyond the enemy. Booby traps, including explosive devices, pits lined with sharpened bamboo stakes, and boxes containing venomous snakes or spiders were common. The rats had to be prepared for the worst, as every step could be their last. The air was stale and thick with the scent of rot, and soldiers often had to stay in the tunnels for days, only emerging at night to scavenge for food. The physical and psychological toll of this job was immense. Soldiers faced not only the constant threat of death, but also the fear of the unknown. What made it worse was the fact that the Viet Cong had the upper hand in knowing the tunnels better than the American soldiers ever could. Psychological warfare. Psychological warfare in the jungles of Vietnam was as terrifying as the physical battles. One of the most chilling tactics used by the U.S. military was Operation Wandering Soul, a PSYOP strategy aimed at disrupting the enemy's morale. This operation involved playing eerie recordings through loudspeakers, featuring what were meant to be the voices of dead North Vietnamese soldiers. These recordings, known as Ghost Tape Number 10, included wailing sounds, cries of anguish, and messages urging the living to abandon their cause and return home. The goal was to exploit the Vietnamese belief in wandering spirits, using the fear of haunted souls to break their resolve. Though its effectiveness remains unclear, it stands as a disturbing example of psychological manipulation during the war. The terrible reality of weapons. Imagine being deep in the jungle, surrounded by enemy forces, and suddenly your weapon jams. This was a common occurrence for American soldiers early in the Vietnam War. The M16 rifle, which was supposed to be the next generation of military weapons, was riddled with problems. The rifle, designed to be lighter and more efficient than its predecessor, the M14, was prone to jamming, especially in the harsh conditions of the Vietnamese jungle. Early versions of the M16 had a number of design flaws that made them unreliable. The military's decision to use cheaper ball powder instead of the more effective propellant led to the guns frequently jamming in the heat of battle. Soldiers unable to rely on their standard-issue weapons often had to resort to using the enemy's AK-47 rifles, which were far more reliable. The failure of the M16 was not just a technical issue, it had life-or-death consequences. Soldiers found themselves in firefights with weapons that simply didn't work, making the danger they faced all the more terrifying. The children of the dust. The Vietnam War also left a painful legacy for many children born to American soldiers and Vietnamese women. Known as Amerasians, these children were often ostracized by both American and Vietnamese societies. In the eyes of the Vietnamese, they were reminders of the foreign enemy, while in the United States, they were seen as the result of fraternizing with the enemy. These children, sometimes referred to as children of the dust, faced difficult lives both in Vietnam and when attempting to resettle in the U.S. after the war. In 1975, as the U.S. prepared to withdraw from Vietnam, a plan known as Operation Baby Lift was launched to evacuate Amerasian orphans. The operation, which aimed to bring thousands of children to the U.S., faced significant challenges, including a tragic plane crash that claimed the lives of 138 people. Despite the horrors and setbacks, Operation Baby Lift continued, and an estimated 3,300 children were brought to the U.S. However, the morality of the operation has been questioned, as it was seen by some as an attempt to absolve the United States of responsibility for the children's plight. Tiger cages. The tiger cages used by the South Vietnamese government during the war are among the most horrific examples of human rights abuses. These small, cramped cells were designed to punish and torture political prisoners, suspected Viet Cong fighters, and anyone deemed an enemy of the state. Prisoners were often packed into these tiny cages with little room to move or breathe, and the conditions were unbearable. One of the most notorious places where these tiger cages were used was on Con Son Island, a former French colonial prison. Conditions there were brutal, with prisoners suffering from malnutrition, disease, and horrific physical abuse. Many prisoners died in these cages, and the truth of the tiger cages was not revealed until years later, when a delegation discovered their existence and photos were leaked to the press. Ear necklaces. The Vietnam War also gave rise to some of the most disturbing war crimes, with one of the most infamous being the practices of the Tiger Force, an elite unit of the U.S. Army. This unit, created in 1965, was tasked with conducting covert operations deep in the jungle. However, by 1967, the unit had gained a horrific reputation for its brutal actions. Members of the Tiger Force were responsible for a series of war crimes, including indiscriminate killings and the taking of gruesome trophies. One of the more chilling practices was the collection of ear necklaces, trophies made by cutting off the ears of dead enemies and wearing them as macabre jewelry. Despite a secret investigation into the atrocities committed by Tiger Force, no one was ever prosecuted, and the investigation was buried for years. Thanks for watching! If you found this deep dive into the Vietnam War fascinating and want to learn more about history's most gripping conflicts, make sure to hit the like and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.